loves a good story. Whether it's tales of heroes set once upon a time, or villainous drama, downfall and redemption.
Ready?
Well, get comfy, because this gun's full of it. The Thompson, a classic SMG, evocative of an entire era. Favourite of both gangster and GI alike. So, who exactly was the Thompson designed for? Why was it co-opted by a rather nefarious lot? And how did it shed its criminal image? The early 20th century is defined by great invention and by war. New technology changed the battlefield, and in the case of the First World War, brought a stalemate unlike any other. John Tolliver Thompson, officer of the US Army and small arms specialist, recognized the need for a new type of weapon. Earlier emplaced automatic weapons such as the Gatling gun and Maxim machine gun had already proven their worth as a force multiplier, and Thompson envisioned a scaled-down version, a one-man trench broom capable of making a clean sweep of muddy standoff. Codenamed the Annihilator, its primary attribute was man-portable automatic fire, feeding from either a 20-round box magazine or a 50-round drum. Its firing mechanism was based on an existing patent called the Blish lock, a mechanically simple action that relies on friction rather than any more complex means of siphoning cartridge power. This did limit the weapon to lower pressure ammunition. In fact, the only service cartridge suitable was that used in the M1911 handgun, 45 ACP. Still, 45 caliber is far from anemic, especially not when served up at 700 rounds per minute. If Colt was the equalizer, Thompson would tilt the odds. Unfortunately, his design was finalized just as the war came to a close. His plan to profit from European conflict foiled by armistice. The Annihilator had to find a new market, and a more fitting name. Something less vulgar, yet still evocative of its firepower. Thompson called it a submachine gun. It was the first weapon to bear such a moniker, but it wasn't the first that fit the definition. There were numerous attempts at a handheld automatic weapon during World War I, with the most successful being the Bergmann MP-18. It was used by German troops, but it came too late to make an appreciable difference. And so this new class of weapon remained unproven, at least for now. The 1920s were a particularly dynamic decade. An economic and cultural boom, jazz, flappers, and Art Deco let the good times roll. Spirits were dampened slightly by prohibition, but in the name of free enterprise, plenty of rum runners stepped up to fill America's glass. With no trenches left to clear, the Thompson was marketed as an anti-bandit gun, an escalation of power over typical police weapons, and a sure deterrent against organized crime. The trouble was, nothing stopped the gangsters from getting their own. America had an odd sort of liberty. You couldn't legally buy a drink, but an automatic weapon? No problem. And so, far from being associated with justice, the Thompson became a weapon of terror. 50 rounds on tap, and small enough to be concealed in a violin case. It was a favoured tool of the mafia, at least for those who could afford it, and one that came to be associated with criminals like Al Capone and John Dillinger. The distant chatter of its fire earned it a new nickname, the Chicago typewriter, and its deadly report filed frequent feature in the news, most famously in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 killed in a herald of 70 shots. Truly, it was the gun that made the 20s roar. Such tales of crime made it to the cinema, and no gangster film was complete without a shootout. The Thompson with drum magazine fast became an essential fixture, with its recognizable profile and stubby length, a perfect fit for a cinematic frame. Wielded by cigar-chomping anti-heroes, the Thompsons' appearances on screen were far more glamorous than the gruesome trail of bodies it left in the morgue. The feel-good decade had come to a close, and the Great Depression lay ahead. Prohibition ended in 1933. After all, it was a largely ineffective measure, and the moralists had bigger fish to fry. A year later, the National Firearms Act passed, making it more difficult for criminals to get their hands on weapons like the Thompson. It imposed heavy taxes on their purchase, doubling the already expensive price, and helped pave the way for future gun control. Also enforced from the same year, the Motion Picture Production Code laid out self-regulating guidelines for Hollywood. No longer would crime be romanticized, nor would violent shootings be standard fare. The action-packed gangster films of the 1930s were snuffed out. This code would endure until the late 60s, with the more liberal attitude of the era encouraging a new wave of American cinema, including a revival of crime films, such as Bonnie and Clyde, and the particularly influential The Godfather. The Godfather's success spawned 2 sequels, and similar films such as Scarface and Goodfellas. And all of these together provide a key source of inspiration for the rise of crime-themed video games that happened in the wake of Grand Theft Auto. The well-dressed mafia were heroes once more, and their tools of the trade back in action.
You can stop this.
For those stories set in the authentic era, the Thompson's automatic fire and drum magazine remain an essential feature. The Thompson has an indelible cultural link with early 20th century crime. Any movie, any television show, any game, where there are gangsters, the Thompson isn't far behind. However, to tell tales of the Thompson in crime is to only tell half the story. After the roaring 20s and slightly more somber 30s, the Thompson was to reinvent itself in a rather different role.
That's it.
Once again, the world was at war. Europe in turmoil and the rise of Nazi Germany. Thompson himself died in 1940, just prior to America's involvement in the war, sparked by Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941. However, his weapon had finally managed to fulfill its original purpose as a war-fighting machine. And as the US Army mobilized, they placed massive orders. It was issued to corporals, sergeants, scouts, tank crews, and patrol leaders, with over 1.5 million units manufactured during the war. Initially, the Thompsons' prior association with unsavory characters hadn't been forgotten. Some anti-US propaganda attempted to paint America as a bunch of gun-toting criminals. Clearly, they didn't account for America's romantic view of the villain. And besides, it didn't take long for the Thompson to forge a more valiant identity. Wartime pressure led to a few changes to the Thompson design, eventually leading to the M1 and M1A1 revisions, easing manufacture and improving suitability for field use, which in turn gave it a new silhouette. The iconic drum magazines were spurned by the military. They were heavy, less reliable, tougher to load, and they rattled somewhat when on the move. So instead, 30-round box magazines were used. The front grip was replaced with a simpler horizontal handguard in most military models, less fragile and more compatible with a sling. Its rear sight was swapped for a snag-free design that needed less machining and could withstand a few knocks. It also turned out that the blish lock was entirely unnecessary, and with a little re-engineering, the M1 Thompson worked just fine as a straightforward blowback weapon. And so, as America went to war, the Thompson went along, seen in the hands of the Allies across the Pacific, European, and North African theatres. Its design was mature and problems rare. Altogether, the Thompson was a well-liked, capable SMG. A little heavy and ineffective at longer ranges, but it worked. and it looked pretty good doing it. As cameras became both more commonplace and more compact, photography was now an important factor in the documentation of World War II. Key moments were captured and given widespread distribution via newspaper, and often seen in the hands of Allied soldiers, was the Thompson. It was these images that inspired the retelling of war stories in both literature and film. While the memory was still fresh, most media intended for popular consumption softened the depiction of war, taking a more virtuous tack that flattered the victors, making heroes of Allied soldiers. The bleak death and destruction were muted, instead replaced with plucky defiance and tales of camaraderie. It wasn't really until 50 years after the end of the war that more realistic depictions found success at the box office. Saving Private Ryan had a grittier, more tragic outlook, an injection of grisly realism into the technicolor heroism of yore. Its famous Normandy beach landing scene was particularly effective. A soldier's perspective of the events, bullets zipping overhead, and camera-shaking explosions carving craters in the sand. The first-person portrayal of war in film was married perfectly to the emerging FPS genre in games, and a complement of realistic firearms were brought to replace the generic pistols and rocket launchers seen before. The Thompson was amongst them, of course, and with its large magazine and fully automatic fire, it makes a desirable choice. And a satisfying spray and lack of necessary precision makes it one particularly suited to beginners. Given that most games put the player in the boots of an American soldier, the Thompson is a very common starter weapon, and extensively used, at least until it's dropped in favour of a more exotic enemy weapon. In the years that followed, the American aspect of the Second World War was milked dry. Every front, every battle, over and over. And found in the hands of every sergeant, and in the cover of every game, the Thompson a totem of a new era of unimaginative box art. With a glut of similar games, a certain weariness set in, forcing publishers to seek the next big thing, leaving World War II, and by association the Thompson, in the past. Truthfully, the Thompson was obsolescent even before World War II began, so its hopes of surviving another bout of post-war peace were slim. America largely replaced the Thompson with the M3 grease gun, a weapon that had none of the elegance or style of the Thompson, but all of the functionality at a fraction of the cost. As wartime orders dried up, manufacturing ceased and assets were sold. The Thompson's time as a hellraiser was over. And so, the SMG retired. But you can't really keep a good thing down, and the Thompson isn't afraid to be seen outside of its conventional roles. Wherever it goes, it paints a vivid image by its presence alone. Sometimes it's just a throwback, a cultural nod to its era, or acknowledgement of a game's World War II roots. Sometimes it's a transplant, thrust into unexpected time or an alternate history. An anachronism in action, whether it's gangsters in space or a post-apocalyptic film noir. No other firearm evokes an era quite like it. Part sinner, part saint. Known by 100 names, an incredible gun that spits unbelievable tales. But the most amazing thing is that they're all true. The Thompson, Annihilator, Chicago Typewriter, Tommy Gun. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, farewell.